Riffs are too repetitive, the lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides and the cover art's a mess. There's so much here to tear apart. Listen to it for a week, now that week has passed. It's Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Why I Hate This Album, the show where we pick an album, listen to it for an entire week, and then come back here and tell you why we do or do not hate it. I am one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey. Not with me as usual, co-host extraordinaire, Timothy Richardson. He is out. Well, folks, I know where he is. I'm not going to tell you where he is. It is not official Why I Hate This Album business. I do not approve of where he is, and it's up to him as to whether or not he wants to explain why he had to miss an episode when he returns. But usually joined by co-host extraordinaire Timothy Richardson, but this week, of course, with him out comes a solo cast. I've done a few of these in the past. If you're new to the show, this is where I hunker down, learn everything I can possibly learn about a single individual, or in some instances, a collection of people, and then I tell you a story. This week, I've chosen Townes Van Zandt, not really because I had any particular attachment to him, but because you, the listeners, insisted upon it. I put the feelers out there, and overwhelmingly, Townes came up as the winner. So, as usual, guys, I probably missed some stuff. You know, I'm not a historian. I only have so much time in the day. This is a free show, so if I missed something or I got it a little wrong, feel free to let me know, but, relax. Before we dive into it, as always, we want to hear from you. You can go to hatepod.com, which apparently was down for a couple of weeks. I had no idea, and you can reach out to us there. You can find every episode in every format you could possibly want, but you can also reach out to us by clicking on Contact Us in the upper left-hand corner, and we'd love to hear from you. We love feedback. We like songs, weird snippets from the show, questions, stories about these albums. Reach out. You can also follow us on social media. We are on Twitter at AlbumHatePod, Instagram at HatePod. I mean, if you want to talk about the show, it's out there. Okay, let's get on into it, guys. If you don't know who Townes Van Zandt is, he is a Texas country folk singer that should have been more popular than he was. Certainly should have been more famous than he was. And you're going to find out over the course of this podcast exactly why, well, at least some of the reasons why he wasn't. It's an interesting story, a lot of twists and turns, a lot of ups, whole lot of downs. I hope you enjoy it. Without further ado, I give you Paper Cowboy, the life and death of Townes Van Zandt.
Came of age and I found a girl in a Tuscaloosa bar.
The history of Texas cannot be told without mentioning the Van Zandt family. Starting in a single-room log cabin in 1839, they've been instrumental in several stages of the state's history. First helping to get Texas annexed by the United States, then later, of course, helping to assemble Confederate regiments to fight the North, only to then spearhead the connection of all major U.S. rail lines through Fort Worth, setting that city up to become a transportation hub for years to come. Generations of Van Zandts with amazing stories are littered throughout Texas history, but our story begins with a man named Harris Van Zandt in 1940. Harris had just graduated from UT Law School and lettered in football because what we were doing in 1940 didn't even sort of resemble football. And lucky for him, he was dating Dorothy Townes at the time. You see, Dorothy's father happened to be John Townes Jr., the son and founder of UT Law School, and the current dean of the UT Law School. He worked at one of the most prestigious, if not the most prestigious law firm in Texas, named Vinson & Elkins. In case anyone's curious, this is one of those law firms that's so big and fancy that it very much still exists today with 12 offices all over the world. Anyway, Harris married Dorothy and began working for her father, and after having their first child, moved from Houston to Fort Worth in 1941. World War II meant the oil business was booming, and since Harris's clients were all energy companies, that meant the Van Zandts were doing pretty good. Then on March 7th, 1944, John Townes Van Zandt was born, the middle child to his older sister Donna and younger brother Bill, in the city his great-grandfather had helped to establish. While both sides of the family were wealthy, Townes' parents lived a relatively modest life, but still very comfortable. Townes was your typical little boy with boundless energy and limitless mischief. Frances, the family's housekeeper, recalls numerous instances of him harassing his sister or narrowly avoiding death from his own curiosity. After World War II, new oil markets began to open up in West Texas, and Townes' father, Harris, being a corporate lawyer, benefited greatly. What's weird is the family never bought a house. They would rent one till the kids got too big, and then they would just go rent a bigger one. As Townes got older, he became interested in cowboy stories and began to collect various books that Frances would read to him in between between working on his cap gun skills and reenacting dramatic death scenes with Jimmy, a foster child and basically surrogate brother that the Van Zandts had taken in. The family also spent a great deal at Uncle Brownie Rice's ranch outside of Houston. If you're wondering, yes, that is the same Rice family for which the university is named, so it was probably a pretty nice ranch. While at the ranch, Townes would try his best to turn his cowboy stories into reality, and began a lifelong love of horses. By no means would anyone call Townes a horseman, but he knew how to saddle and ride a horse, and was fairly competent, at least enough to not fall off. In 1952, the oil business took the family to Midland, Texas for about 6 months before they were forced to move again, this time to Billings, Montana, just as Townes was entering the 4th grade. While it always meant starting over, Townes had a knack for making friends, and within a few days of the move, Townes would have a whole new set of friends, not only for himself, but for his siblings and for Jimmy. Many summers, the children, their mother Dorothy, her sisters, and all the cousins would stay at a place called Chautauqua Community near Boulder, Colorado. Apparently, the Chautauqua Institution sponsored large camps billed as cultural and educational retreats where they would enjoy symphonies and theaters and educational lectures and recreational activities. I looked into this a little bit. It all kind of sounds like a cult, but when I looked at the website, I think it's just a summer camp where your whole family can go. And if anyone's curious, it very much still exists. You can still do this to this day, although it looks very, very fancy, and a little less summer camp, a little more summer resort. In any event, back in Billings, on September 9th, 1956, Townes' life was changed forever. That was the night that Elvis Presley first appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. He later said, quote, "I just thought Elvis had all the money in the world, and all the Cadillacs, and all the girls, and all he did was play the guitar and sing. That made a big impression on me." 3 months later, when his father asked what he wanted for Christmas, Townes didn't hesitate. He wanted a guitar. They made a deal that if Townes learned Fräulein, a sappy country song popular at the time, then he could have his guitar. Townes unwrapped a new guitar on Christmas Day, and by New Year's he could play Fräulein for his father front to back. Interestingly, this would be a song that he would continue to play for his entire life, and even appeared on an album. After he mastered that first song, Townes began to move through genres, soaking up as much as he could. It was obvious that the guitar wasn't a hobby, it was going to be who he was. Townes' musical foundation was formed on American country and Western music, and the burgeoning rock and roll of the post-war radio boom of the 50s and 60s. He listened and learned from jazz and blues and later folk, but it was the long drives to the oil fields with his father that made the deepest impact. Artists like Lefty Frizzell and Hank Williams were already legends and could be reliably heard on the radio as one station faded out and Townes worked the dial to tune in the next one. In 1958, his father's job at Pure Oil required the family to move again, this time to Boulder, Colorado. Having spent all those summers at the weird summer family camp at Chautauqua, left everyone pretty excited to leave Montana and pretty stoked to be going to Colorado. That September, Townes began attending Boulder High School. By this age, not only was his intelligence obvious, but also Townes displayed a curious sensitivity, uncommon among teenage boys, and a rebellious streak that was all too common. Now keep in mind, it's 1958, so rebellious is all relative. One example that I was able to find was when Townes decided to wear brightly colored pants to school, and rather than being ostracized, it became a fad. It became so popular that school administrators believed that it was becoming a distraction and eventually called Townes' mother to come pick him up and force him to change into some more conservative pants and end this insanity. So when I say rebellious in those early years, not so rebellious, but trust me, we're going to get plenty rebellious. As Townes continued to improve on guitar, he began to play more for friends and especially for family. The Van Zandts would travel back to Texas often for family gatherings, and Townes would always be the star of the family talent show, even when he didn't want to be. Townes would sometimes very purposely leave his guitar at home to ensure that he couldn't be enticed to play, only to learn that his father had snuck it into the trunk before they left, and he would eventually be cajoled to take the stage. Just as the family was settling into a nice routine in Colorado, Harris was transferred again. So, midway through the 1958-1959 school year, the family moved to Barrington, Illinois, just outside Chicago. This move cast a shadow over the Van Zandt family. They were happy in Boulder, and it seemed like the pressures of Harris's new job were beginning to weigh on him. Whenever there were tough negotiations or layoffs, it always seemed to be Harris's job to do the dirty work. That emotional toll somehow spread through the house and took roots in his boys. Toward the end of his sophomore year, Townes was dared to enter the local school talent show, and not wanting to be called a chicken, he accepted. He played 3 songs, one by Elvis Presley, the next by Ricky Nelson, and a third by Hank Williams. The girls screamed from the audience, as was the style at the time, and the crowd cheered. Instantly, Townes was a cool kid, which makes what happens next all the stranger. Before starting his junior year, Townes switched schools to attend Shattuck Military Academy in 1960. Allegedly worried that he would have to continue moving, Townes opted to be sent away where he knew it wouldn't matter where his dad worked. But Shattuck was a hardcore, no-bullshit ROTC program that didn't seem like any kind of place a popular musician who had just won his school talent show would want to spend his teen years, especially not somebody like Townes. Some rumors point to this having been an incident or a cover-up that necessitated Townes leaving Barrington, but other stories point to the fact that he wanted to make his father proud, so he went. Whatever the reason, once Townes got there, he looked for every opportunity to bend or just outright break every single rule that Shattuck had. This was a very conservative ROTC program with rules about rules, so it wasn't really hard for you to step out of bounds. Hell, even playing his guitar was considered a counterculture statement. At the time, most of his fellow cadets were into Miles Davis and Dave Brubeck, not rock and roll, and certainly not country and western. Now, many of his indiscretions during this time were minor or even expected. Things like failing to shine his shoes or wearing his hat just slightly askew enough that it probably wasn't an accident. Then there's the slightly more adult activities. Things like heavy drinking, sneaking off with girls from St. Mary's, or the even more interesting, sniffing excessive glue. I looked into this a little bit. Apparently sniffing glue was really popular in the 60s with teens when alcohol couldn't be available, and it was when marijuana was still being called jazz cigarettes. No matter the vice, Townes always did it harder than the other boys, especially sniffing glue. There was even a photo in the school's yearbook in his senior year that could have threatened his graduation. It was Townes maniacally looking at the camera with an entire tube of glue shoved up his nose. Glue abuse aside, Townes still graduated that summer and worked with a seismograph crew on an oil field with his dad's company. He of course left with 2 weeks to go, hitchhiked to Fort Worth, and eventually Oklahoma, where he started visiting old friends from Shattuck. When his dad found out, he was of course furious, but by then Townes had been accepted to the University of Colorado Boulder and was set to begin that fall. Townes began college in September of 1962, and by October he left. He hitchhiked to Minnesota, stayed with an old girlfriend he had, and then eventually showed up back at Shattuck Military School asking for a job. The headmaster, who had always liked Townes and wanted to help the boy, worked to create a position for him. Then they called Townes' parents and let him know the plan. Townes' parents reluctantly accepted, and of course, 2 weeks later, Townes showed back up at his parents' house. He had left the job that the headmaster had worked so hard to create for him and decided he wanted to live in Houston. While probably not discussed at the time, it is believed that Townes may have just been facing serious depression and anxiety in that first semester of school and had no idea how to deal with it or probably even how to tell anybody what was happening. After spending the holidays at home, Townes gave college a second try. He began working at a bar called Tulagis and moved in with a coworker named Bob Myrick. This time Townes didn't leave school, but he didn't actually go either. He would spend all week locked in his room, drinking cheap wine and playing guitar, only to emerge on a Friday, throw a giant party, and then find some new and exciting way to risk his life before locking himself away again. The most legendary tale of this time was when Townes decided to freefall from the 4th story of an apartment, only to land on his back, stand up, and be waiting in the doorway when his guests emerged from the elevator, shocked that he wasn't dead. Now, according to Myrick, his roommate at the time, it was the 3rd story. He jumped and he did sprain his ankle. But that's not how legends are made. So he fell and he was fine. Because Townes didn't go to his classes, that first semester back was mostly C's and F's. He returned his sophomore year and met Fran Petters while working the door at Tulagis. The two hit it off quickly and they began dating. While both in the Arts and Sciences College, Fran was studying math and working for the president of the university, whom she coincidentally also lived behind in his garage apartment. While Townes, on the other hand, took the core curriculum and didn't study anything. Fran loved Townes' free spirit, and she put up with his heavy drinking. She even put up with the strange habit he had developed of drunk mountain climbing. See, it wasn't uncommon for him to get a few beers deep and around 11:30 or 12 at night, lead a group of friends mountain climbing. Not hiking, mountain climbing. Eventually, this led exactly where you'd expect it to. There was a really nasty fall, and that put an end to all drunk night climbing. Throughout all the drinking and the stunts, Townes never neglected his guitar. He practiced constantly, able to learn new songs in minutes after hearing them, and already beginning to develop some of his own. By 1964, it wasn't the Beatles that Townes was obsessed with. It was John Lee Hooker and Blind Lemon Jefferson, and this new guy that had just started to appear named Bob Dylan. Townes had a dark cynicism about him that was hard to penetrate, but when he played guitar, even early versions of his own songs, you could see that there was a deep well of emotion and vulnerability. Townes' depression became somewhat predictable for his friends. He'd be jubilant, overflowing with confidence, followed by periods of deep depression and reclusiveness, all the while drinking all day and more than occasionally sniffing some glue. Things came to a head when Tom Barrow, Townes' best friend and former classmate from Shattuck, forged a letter to the dean claiming to be Townes' parents, granting their son permission to take the rest of the semester off. Townes' plan was to move to Oklahoma, work on a labor crew, and focus on his playing. He claimed to have grown tired of the, quote, aristocratic class and wanted to focus on his craft. Unfortunately for him, Townes' parents caught wind of the scheme and flew to Colorado to surprise their son. The morning they arrived was after another all-night rager, and their son was unresponsive on the floor with copious amounts of glue stuck in his sideburns. Disturbed by the scene that greeted them, and a recent phone call from a doctor in the Boulder area that said he was worried that Townes may be having suicidal thoughts, the family pulled their son from the rug and from the school and brought him back to Houston. From there, they told Townes that they were going down to Galveston under the guise of a fishing trip with Townes' Uncle Donnie. Instead, on March 14th at the age of 20, Townes Van Zandt was admitted to the Titus Harris Clinic for Psychiatric Evaluation and Treatment. Considered one of the finest psychiatric facilities of the day and one of the first that actually had a dedicated department for youth and adolescents, they subjected Townes to a barrage of tests and concluded that he suffered from obsessive-compulsive disorder, he was a sensitive artistic type, and he was very respectful to authority, but likely to harbor resentment internally towards those authority figures. They also noticed a growing tendency towards paranoia that was becoming more prominent with age. Finally, the medical report notes a serious sense of inadequacy created by the fear that Townes wasn't living up to the expectations of his father, and the slightly more difficult to parse, quote, indications of some feminine elements in his character, and these feminine elements threaten his whole value system, sense of self, and adequacy as a male, end quote. What I think all that means is that he was sensitive and he liked music, but it was 1964, so that was actually something that needed to be treated in men. The final official diagnosis was schizophrenic reaction or schizoaffective type depression. The treatment was a combination of insulin coma therapy and electroshock treatments. Nearly 40 in total between April and June of 1964, during which time Townes was not allowed to leave the hospital except on very rare supervised exceptions. Now, in case anybody's curious, we all know what electroshock therapy looks like. We've seen it in enough movies, but let's spend a minute on insulin coma therapy. This is something I was not familiar with. What they did was they slowly would increase the amounts of insulin they injected into a patient to lower their blood sugar and eventually put them into a coma for about 30 minutes or so before injecting glucose and bringing them out of it. Now, on the plus side, it turns out that the electroconvulsive therapy shocks were usually applied just before the patient was brought out of the coma, so I guess it wasn't all bad that they were putting you into a medically induced coma to cure your schizophrenia that you may or may not have had. Ugh. In any event, 40 different treatments over 3 months is excessive. Now, it's obvious by today's standards that Townes was not schizophrenic. He was manic depressive or maybe bipolar, but the treatment for the acute psychotic episode that he was experiencing caused by his depression and full-on psychosis at the time was exactly the same. Today, a doctor would see he's self-medicating with alcohol, get him sober, and then start him on a combination of antidepressants and talk therapy. But it's 1964, so instead, it's comas and shocks for you, young man. Even in this environment, Townes rebelled. Somehow he managed to get his hands on a bottle of wine that a friend snuck in, which he was of course caught with when he became incredibly drunk, and it forced him to have to stay even longer. Eventually, his doctors did agree that Townes had improved enough to be discharged in June of 1964, released to his parents with barely any medication and absolutely no plan for continued care. When Townes returned to Houston, he was calmer, though he had a hard time remembering his childhood, which, 40 shocks and comas might do that to you. His parents wouldn't allow him to return to Boulder for college, but did encourage him to enroll at pre-law at the University of Houston. Fran remarkably remained his girlfriend through all of this, and even agreed to transfer back to her hometown so she could attend her senior year at the University of Houston, and the two could be together. So in January of 1965, Townes enrolled in the pre-law program and made his parents proud. He stayed focused and out of trouble. That August, Townes made them even happier when he married Fran, twice. The wedding was scheduled for August 26, 1965, but the two secretly got married one day earlier during the dress rehearsal. You see, back in 1963, President Kennedy had changed the draft regulations so that married men were selected after the single men, leading to a rash of marriages, all known as the Kennedy men. But then LBJ issues an executive order stating that all men married after August 26, 1965 without children would be considered exactly the same as single men as far as the draft was concerned. So they had to get their marriage license signed one day early. After the second fake wedding the next day, the two had a modest honeymoon in Aspen and moved into a very modest one-bedroom apartment to finish school. During this time, the couple was happy, spending most weekends with their families, fishing, or on the beach in Galveston. Townes wasn't drinking, but from time to time a shadow would fall over him. He would want to be alone for a few days or even a week, but then he would spring back to his normal, happy, productive self. But life wasn't easy. Since they were both in school, they never had any money. Townes' parents paid for the apartment, but the rest was up to them. Luckily, Townes' passion for music had never waned, and in fact, his newfound discipline allowed him to focus much more on his music than he ever had before. With few other marketable skills, Townes actually began playing for $10 a night at the Jester Lounge on Westheimer Boulevard in Houston. He took the stage not out of a desire to play for others, but simply because Fran refused to eat macaroni and cheese for another night. The Jester was one of a handful of folk clubs in the city that would pay $10 or maybe $15 to play for the night. Another club was the Sand Mountain Coffee House. There, Townes met a lifelong friend, fellow musician, Guy Clark. As Townes became more ingrained in the scene, he met more heroes and peers that inspired him and his songwriting. He became friends with Lightnin' Hopkins, who was a regular at the Houston clubs, but was someone Townes had been listening to since he was in high school. Lightning had helped inspire Townes' stray from the more traditional folk path to his blues-oriented approach. Also around this time, Townes became friends with a young man from New York named Jerry Jeff Walker. Walker was writing new, interesting songs at a time when many of their peers were still singing classic tales of folklore curated by the Houston Folklore Society. I kid you not, they had a society to regulate folk. But Townes was part of a new generation, pushing the boundaries of the genre and incorporating influences from other types of music. I should also mention that although officially, at least according to his wife at the time, he wasn't drinking, I found several accounts of Townes performing at these various clubs around this time completely blackout drunk, even going so far as to tying a bottle of wine onto a rope, hanging that rope out a window, and then pulling the rope up when people leave the room to take pulls off the bottle. They're just stories, but based on what we're going to learn about Townes, I highly suspect that's accurate. Once focused on his music, Townes quickly began to make a name for himself. He became the house act at the Sand Mountain Cafe. He and Fran moved into the apartment above the club, where owner Mrs. Garrett became Townes' boss and landlord. In exchange for cleaning the club and opening for bigger acts, he got free rent and even a little bit of money at the end of the week for some food. Townes created a makeshift studio out of the closet and would spend hours in there just writing and recording. It was while living in this small apartment that Townes would write many, or at least the start of many, of the songs that he's known for today, including Waiting Around to Die, the song he credited multiple times as his first serious song. But he also wrote several silly songs, simple talking blues songs about shrimp or jokes about nuns. He had a very unique act. It wasn't just music. He ingratiated the crowd through a folksy persona. Early recordings of Townes at the Jester in 1965 showcase his influences and that early style. He plays guitar like Lightnin' Hopkins and has a crack in his voice like Hank Williams. He moves effortlessly between originals and covers and keeps the crowd's attention in between songs with dry, self-deprecating humor and really good timing. In January of 1966, Harris Van Zandt, Townes' father, suddenly died of a heart attack at the age of 52. Naturally, this sent Townes into a fairly deep depression, but it also drove him to focus more on his songwriting. Curiously, looking for some sort of structure, Townes decided that he would join the Army at the height of the Vietnam War. However, one of the recruiting questions at the time was, have you ever been admitted to a mental hospital? And since Townes had recently spent a good amount of time in Galveston, his doctor refused to sign the waiver. Instead, he sent a letter into the recruitment office that said Townes was, quote, only marginally adapting to life since being released. Curiously, he also wrote that Townes should be allowed to drift and find himself, a detail that I can't imagine a recruitment officer had any control over. Also a really bad idea. Unfortunately, Townes saw this letter from his doctor and took away two things. One, he was crazy, and two, he should hit the road. Fran had begun working at the Shell Oil Company after she graduated, but in 1967, less than a year later, she quit so she could drive cross-country in an RV with Townes that his mother had decorated for the two while he played small clubs, mostly in Oklahoma and Texas. And it was fun while it lasted, but it didn't last long. $10 a night, and sometimes no dollars a night, is not enough money for two people to live on, and so Fran returned to Houston a few months later. Fran went back to Shell, and Townes kept writing and performing at the clubs that were by now becoming a real scene in Houston. Outwardly, Fran and Townes were getting along great, but in reality, the two were starting to drift apart. Since getting married, Townes had made it a point to keep Fran life and the vices and questionable people he hung around in his music life as separate as possible. However, going on tour in that RV had begun to expose Fran to the other side of Townes, the one that she thought he had left in Galveston. And as music became a bigger part of Townes' life, it was harder to hide what he was doing. And it wasn't even that he feared Fran wouldn't approve or make him stop. It was that he felt like she was some sort of pure angel, and he didn't want to expose her to this lifestyle. He even got upset when she would swear. Now, in case there was any confusion as to whether or not Townes was happy in the relationship, it was all cleared up when he wrote Tower Song. In the song, the singer admonishes his lover for her conventional ideas about love and responsibility. The song doesn't have Fran's name in it, but it might as well have just been called Ode to Fran. Mickey Newbury was a Houston native that by 1968 was one of the most successful songwriters in Nashville. Newbury had written numerous hits for artists like Elvis Presley, Ray Charles, Tom Jones, and dozens of others, as well as helping to pave the way for more progressive country like Willie Nelson, Chris Christopherson, and his own albums. Weird side note on Mickey Newbury. He has the esteemed honor of having written that song Just Dropped In, the Big Lebowski song performed by Kenny Rogers in the first edition when they were sort of psychedelic before he became, the Kenny Rogers we all know. Anyway, that song is a terrible example of what Mickey Newbury actually did, but it's his biggest hit, so I thought it was kind of funny. Anyway, when Mickey heard Townes, he knew he had found something special. This curious blend of blues riffs and Bob Dylan-style thoughtful lyrics wasn't something he had seen anywhere else, and he wanted to get it on tape. They became fast friends, and Newbury signed Townes to his first management deal. He then took Townes back to Nashville to perform for the record companies, but nobody was interested. Luckily, around this time, a man named Jack Clement was in town to check out the local talent. Clement was a legend in the record business, having his hand in starting multiple successful studios and writing or producing songs for Roy Orbison and Johnny Cash. He was visiting Bill Jones, the owner of Jones Studios, and kept hearing about this guy who would drink a bottle of wine and sing all night. Jones and Townes' manager, Mickey, played some of the recordings for Clement. He liked what he heard, and Townes signed his first publishing deal with Hall Clement with the understanding that they would also produce an album for him. Now signed, Townes began some initial recording, while Clement began shopping Townes around with demos to potential buyers. When he played the song Tecumseh Valley for New York businessman and founder of Poppy Records, Kevin Eggers, it was love at first listen, and he agreed to make Townes' album. They began work on the album in the fall of 1968. But it wasn't the creative experience Townes was expecting. The sessions were dictatorial. Clement produced while Eggers gave constantly ignored suggestions. The men argued over which direction to take the album and how to frame Townes as an artist. Some of his songs felt like classic country and folk, while others were dry and subversive, similar to the growing underground country from his peers. Townes, for his part, mostly just sat on a stool among several session musicians and played whatever he was told. By Christmas, the album titled For the Sake of the Song was complete. The end result reflected the conflict in the studio, and the album was wildly overproduced. Fearing Townes would fail to connect with audiences, they buried his voice and his guitar under swelling echo filled with choruses and excessive organ filler and other production cliches of the day. Think Phil Spector, Wall of Sound stuff. Way overproduced, whole bunch of strings. While not even close to what anyone wanted, the album did show promise, and the men met to plan their next move. Unfortunately, at the meeting, Kevin Eggers, the Poppy Records owner, declared that Newbury, Townes' longtime friend and manager, wasn't doing his job. Eggers offered to buy out the contract from Newbury for $100,000, but Newbury refused. Not because he wanted more money, but because he didn't trust Eggers, and he figured he would just bleed Townes dry. To prove it, he tore up Townes' contract in front of him. But it didn't work, and Townes signed with Eggers anyway. Even crazier is that Townes and Mickey Newbury were really good friends, not just an artist and a manager. And the only way that they could remain friends was to never ever talk about the fact that he dropped him like a bad habit. Around this time, most sources imply that Townes was partying pretty hard again, and Eggers was painting a wild picture of endless women and alcohol as they made hit records and toured the country. That's not, of course, what happened. After Townes signed with Eggers and the record was released, his big bonus was replaced by a small bonus and almost no royalties. Townes was forced to go back out on the road, touring to barely make ends meet. He and Fran had briefly separated, but reconciled in the summer of 1968 as Fran announced that she was pregnant. This brought all new money troubles. Since it was 1968, the policy at Shell Oil was if you got pregnant, you had to quit your job. And without insurance or any sort of steady income, the pregnancy was tremendously difficult. Fran had just been to the doctor the day before and told that she was right on schedule when on April 11th, 1969, John Townes Van Zandt Jr., or JT, was born. Things were good for the first couple of months, but Townes was determined to stay focused on his songwriting and touring, and not on raising a family. Townes' drinking was near constant at this point, and he had recently discovered something called heroin. What was already a disruptive lifestyle kept at strange hours and with even stranger people became unmanageable for Fran. Townes was getting fucked up and leaving drugs around the house within the reach of their child, and it wasn't uncommon for her to have to come and pick up Townes at 3 or 4 in the morning from a shooting gallery and have to find a sitter for her newborn. The last straw was when Townes began openly sleeping with multiple women, one of whom was a 15-year-old high school dropout named Bianca. If it makes you feel any better, she told him he was 22, but I don't know any 15-year-olds that look 22, so it didn't make me feel better. Townes and Fran officially split up, and Townes went with Kevin Eggers, Jack Clement, and Bob Myrick to California to record the next album. The days were spent working hard in the studio, but the nights were filled with drugs, booze, and women. Despite the hard partying and after several months of working across various LA area studios, Our Mother the Mountain was complete. Townes and his producer's sophomore effort was far better in almost every measurable way than the first album. The production was much more complimentary, not overbearing, and Townes was more the focus, and his skilled songwriting took center stage. After completing the album, Townes and Myrick hitchhiked back to Texas, as was the style at the time. Fun side note, I came across a story around this time from a young country musician named Joe Eli, who claims that he picked up a hitchhiker between Lubbock and Houston. The two didn't speak much in the car, but once they hit Houston, the man got out of the car, pulled a record from his duffel bag, and gave it to him. Allegedly, it was Townes Van Zandt, and he had just given him his new record, Our Mother on the Mountain. I have no idea if that actually happened, but with Townes constantly hitchhiking between Lubbock and Houston, it seems entirely possible. Just before the proper release of the album, Townes went up to New York City to perform at the same folk clubs Bob Dylan had made famous almost a decade before. The folk movement was long dead, but Townes generated some heat anyway as a country folk act to keep an eye on. Back in Texas, he toured with a ragtag group of musicians that would sometimes play together in Austin under the name the Delta Mama Blues, which was a reference to Robitussin DM cough syrup, a then favorite way to get high before they would later remove the codeine from the formula. In the summer of 1969, Townes had begun playing at a new club in downtown Houston called the Old Quarter. Other clubs in town had tried to blackball any musician that played there, but Townes was friends with the owner Rex Bell, and once he played at the Quarter and got his buddy Guy Clark too, everybody did. No one was going to blackball Townes. And if they had, he probably wouldn't have cared. He was doing a lot of drugs. It also helped that the other clubs in town served sodas and coffee, and the Old Quarter sold beer and let people smoke joints on the roof. Meanwhile, back in New York City, Eggers had been doing his part and got Townes set up with an East Coast college tour for the fall with another poppy act called Mandrake Memorial, a band that I think kind of sounds like Strawberry Alarm Clock, the Incense Peppermints folks, or maybe like a Poor Man's Mamas and the Papas. In any event, it couldn't have been a worse coupling. The highlight of this tour was at Carnegie Hall, following comedian Dick Gregory. You can actually hear a recording of this show. The audience is not on Townes' side at all at the beginning. But as he continues to play, he begins to win him over, despite some fairly inappropriate anecdotes about nuns and his favorite way to drink Thunderbird wine. What was funny, though, was it meant absolutely nothing to Townes. In fact, working at Carnegie Hall might have been an insult to him. He had romanticized the cowboy folk wanderer lifestyle. He wanted so badly to be a cowboy from the country instead of a upper middle class rich boy that had everything largely given to him. Allegedly, he also refused to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show for the exact same reason, but I have no idea if that's true. After the tour, Townes continued to travel the South, playing clubs for enough money to get to the next city. He was resolute that he would not reach out to his family for help, no matter how desperate things became. While hitchhiking through Oklahoma with Guy Clark, the couple met a pair of sisters who took a liking to the bedraggled artists. Sadly, a few weeks later, one of the sisters actually passed away while they were still visiting, and the other sister, Susanna, stricken with grief, picked up and moved to Houston with Guy Clark. Townes spent that spring bouncing from couch to couch in Houston, Austin, Dallas, and even as far north as Oklahoma City. During all the drifting around and partying, he continued to write songs, and for the first time was actually under a deadline before his next album was due. This time it was back out to Nashville to record, but Jack Clement would not return to produce. He was busy selling millions of records with Charlie Pride and was sick of dealing with Townes' pushy manager Eggers. Instead, Jim Malloy took over at the board with Eggers seated shotgun, of course. They all agreed that Townes' third album needed to be stripped down and utilize more traditional folk instruments and arrangements. Think stand-up bass, acoustic guitar, and a hell of a lot less strings and organ. Townes also took a much more vocal role in the album's creation this time, applying what he had learned from the first two sessions. He also used this album to correct past mistakes, choosing to re-record multiple songs from the first two albums that he felt weren't done justice. What's also likely, though, is that Townes hadn't written enough new material to make an entire new album. Keep in mind, he was habitually drinking and just shy of habitually using heroin at this point. But that didn't mean he'd lost a step. In fact, the new songs that he had written were some of his best to date. The self-titled Townes Van Zandt was released in September of 1969, and Townes went back out on the road. On January 16, 1970, Townes finalized his divorce from Fran. While the split was still amicable, it intensified Townes' downward spiral into addiction. His alcoholism had actually hit new highs, and he was consistently supplementing with heroin. Although, rather than sit quietly and play guitar, now Townes became abusive to men and women alike. He would find somebody to pick on, and then he would just pick and pick and pick until eventually that person, man or woman, would usually break down in tears. Townes' third album performed well enough to get him a spot on the Bitter End tour circuit, named so after the New York Folk Club. It was a series of clubs in college towns that you would play at from Tuesday to Saturday, with the idea being that you build your crowd all week and make your real money Saturday night when everybody comes to see the big show. This is where Townes began to really hone his performance skills. He was already an accomplished fingerpicker guitar player at this point, but at clubs of 100 or 200 people, Townes really learned to play the room. It also afforded him another vice, a steady flow of adoring college girls, and Townes indulged just as heavily in this as he did anything else. He spent the better part of 1970 touring colleges, writing new songs, and having sex with co-eds. His lyrics were becoming more complex, and Townes had found a way to fuse blues and folk to create a sound that was unique to him. He had become a mix of Lightning Hopkins and Bob Dylan, some sort of weird poet of Texas blues, and it was good. Not to mention influential, Townes' surrealistic style and mastery of the guitar has been cited as an influence for more people than I have time to list here, and he's often called a musician's musician. What that means, at least my understanding, is that you have to do it yourself to appreciate everything that you're hearing. You've got to be intimately familiar with the art of making music and performing for others to truly appreciate the complexity of his playing and, more importantly, his songwriting. They're good songs. I'm not sure I hear all that in it. I still like Dylan more. Believe it or not, in the back half of 1970, Townes returned to New York to record his fourth album, this time with experienced producer, a guy named Ron Frangipane. The album was a combination of new songs and again some older ones that Townes hadn't felt were ready for the previous albums but were now complete. Add to that a classic Carter Family cover and the song Delta Mama Blues written while performing with the band of the same name, and the album was done in time for Christmas. The album titled Delta Mama Blues after the song, though for some reason spelled differently, represented another major step in Townes' songwriting, and the production complemented what is now considered the Townes Van Zandt sound. Happy as always to be done with the responsibility of recording, Townes retreated back to Houston in early 1971 where his heroin use reached new heights. In New York, there were enough people depending on him, and more importantly investing money in him, that he couldn't get out of control, and he had to be places at a certain time and not nod off. But in Houston, those guardrails were gone, he had a little money in his pocket, and a whole lot of free time. So Townes spent a good part of 1971 seeing just how close to death he could get. Remarkably, though, despite indulging heavily, Townes continues to tour in support of the album through the spring. While it wasn't selling millions of copies, his fan base was continuing to grow consistently. Around this time, Townes also started a new relationship with a young lady named Leslie Jo Richards. By all accounts, she was a very sweet girl that did not tolerate any of Townes' bullshit, and also didn't mind that he would take off for weeks and months at a time, likely cheating on her rampantly. But it was the 70s, and they weren't official, so let's not make a big deal out of it. That summer, Townes was ready to begin recording his fifth album, this time back in sunny California with Eggers and Jim Malloy splitting recording duties. After a few weeks, Townes became lonely, and Leslie Jo hitchhiked from Houston to LA to be with him. Townes recorded during the day, and he and Leslie Jo would party with Eggers and his wife, Guy and Susanna Clark, and Jim Malloy at night. Not long after Leslie Jo arrived, Susanna received a cryptic phone call from Townes one night asking if she and Guy would come over to see him at his condo. When they arrived, Townes had terrible news. Leslie Joe and Townes had been at the studio that afternoon when Townes realized he had left something back at the condo. Leslie Joe volunteered to go get it so Townes could keep working. As she always did, and was shockingly common for the 70s, she walked out to the road, stuck out her thumb, and hitchhiked back to the condo. A man picked her up soon after, but instead of taking her to the condo, he took her to a country road. There, he stabbed her over 20 times and dumped her still living body into a ditch. Somehow, Leslie Joe managed to gather the strength to drag her blood-soaked body a considerable distance to a house she could see. There, she mustered a death howl on the front porch that summoned an elderly woman. Seeing a stranger dying on her porch, the owner ran to her living room to call the police and paramedics. When she returned to the porch, Leslie Joe had died. Townes, of course, fell into a deep depression, blaming himself, but still managed to finish recording the album. Afterwards, he went back to Houston and moved in with his drug dealer and his drug dealer's wife, south of the city in Pasadena, a petrochemical industrial neighborhood that would have been roughing it even by Tyler Durden's standards. Living with his dealer, he had an endless supply of the best dope in Texas and spent most of his time strung out. Still deeply depressed and more addicted to drugs and alcohol than ever, Townes also began giving away all of his things. Not selling them, and not that he had a lot of things to begin with, but he just gave them away. Even his records. The one thing that he cherished his entire life, he no longer cared about and just gave to people. Somehow, despite all of this, Townes Van Zandt continues to write new songs. More impressively, they're better than his previous songs. Also during this time, Fran began to reach out to Townes, trying to convince him to spend time with their son JT. Fran's thinking was that by spending time with JT, Townes might get some renewed sense of life and maybe JT would actually get to grow up with a father. After several non-committal conversations, Townes did agree to come by and spend the afternoon with his now almost 3-year-old son. The day came and Townes was late, and then he was very late, and then he was officially missing. Fran called around, but no one could find him. Then finally, that night, Fran got a call that Townes was in the hospital, and it was bad. Townes had been staying at his mother's house while she was on vacation and decided to have some friends over to do some heroin. Townes, as usual, got carried away and had such a good time, his heart stopped. His friends called an ambulance, waited a few minutes, and then fled the scene before anyone actually arrived. The legend is, when Townes arrived at the hospital, an intern recognized who he was and insisted that everyone keep trying to revive him. Allegedly, without this guy, they'd have given up on CPR much sooner. But they didn't, and Townes came back to life, and when he did, he began asking for Fran immediately. When she showed up at the hospital, Townes was a mess. They had knocked out a number of his teeth while trying to intubate him, and he was barely able to speak. That night, the doctors told Fran to do whatever she could to keep him awake. So she did. She stayed there all night, holding his hand and talking to him and begging him not to die, holding back the anger she felt for putting her through this and ignoring their child. And in the morning, Townes' condition stabilized, and after several days, he was even released. Later that year, in the fall of 1971, High, Low, and In Between was released. The production was sparse and complimentary, really serving to showcase Townes' talents. Additionally, the end of the 60s and the grisly death of Leslie Joe during the recording brought a weird seriousness to the album that wasn't present in his earlier work. Unfortunately, while it was considered one of Townes' finest artistic achievements, the album still failed to become a major commercial success. Toward the end of 1971, Townes had settled back into his old routines, playing at the same Houston clubs. One night around this time, the Allman Brothers were in town playing sold-out shows at the Houston Coliseum and came down to the Old Quarter to see Townes play. Duane Allman in particular was excited to see the local legend and insisted the whole band come along. It was 1 a.m. when they got there, and Townes had already played 2 sets that night, but when the Allman Brothers come to see you play, and may have brought their good buddy cocaine, you find the energy to get back on stage. They locked the doors and played together till 4 in the morning for a very small, very lucky crowd. Afterwards, they all went upstairs to smoke joints and unwind, and somebody snuck in and robbed the club. Duane felt terrible about the whole thing and told the owner Dale not to make a huge deal out of it, but that he would come back the next day and they'd play a little at the club. Instead, everyone in the entire band but Greg Allman, huge shock, came back and played 2 2-hour sets to help the Quarter make its money back. Townes and Duane were fast friends. They both loved making music and doing drugs and making music while doing drugs, and they probably would have continued to hang out regularly. Unfortunately, on October 29, 1971, Duane Allman died in a motorcycle accident when, allegedly, he had to swerve out of the way for a truck that suddenly pulled out into the road in front of him. In reality, I think the truck was always there, and he came speeding up around the corner. But this is not a biography on Duane Allman. In January of 1972, Townes was living with manager Eggers and his wife in New York when Guy Clark called and asked him to be the best man in his wedding. Townes agreed, came down to Nashville for the wedding, and then stayed for the next 8 months. Guy had a publishing contract but was still dirt poor. Their only furniture was donated to them, and Townes slept on an old mattress they found behind a Safeway. Somehow this did not stop the endless parade of women that he was able to bring back and sleep on his gross used mattress. Over this time, Townes was in and out of the house, going on tour briefly and then bringing back random characters that he'd either met in a cab or in a bar. It was crazy. He collected strange friends like snow globes to remember his trips. And then, of course, these people would hang out for a few days, somebody would get creeped out and then they'd make them leave. Or they'd stay for months and they'd become lifelong friends. You never know. But it wasn't just people that he brought with him. Townes also started traveling with Loop and Lil, 2 parakeets he would smuggle onto planes. He called them his, quote, roadkeets because they were good travelers. Just imagine, a guy next to you on an airplane pulls 2 parakeets out of his pocket and begins talking to them in a drunken stupor. It's stories like this that make me love Townes Van Zandt. A new scene began to form in Nashville around the Clarks, and many of the musicians from Houston who had been wrapped up in heroin began to move and escape their addictions and try to find new starts. Even Townes was able to put his heroin use on the back burner with a little help from Jack Daniels Black so he could be sober enough to play music with his friends. During this summer, Townes continued to visit Texas, playing more and more shows in Austin. He even played a festival called the First Dripping Springs Reunion, which was later renamed the Willie Nelson 4th of July Picnic, and is an event that this narrator has been to several times and still exists to this day. Other artists at that inaugural performance were Waylon Jennings, Billy Joe Shaver, and of course Willie Nelson. A lot of people say that this was the birthplace for outlaw country that was clearly on the rise throughout the South. When not on tour, Townes went back to Nashville to put the finishing touches on his next album, and by the end of 1972, the late great Townes Van Zandt was released. The title was supposed to be a joke by Eggers about Townes' reckless lifestyle, but everybody agreed it might hit a little too close to home. While the album itself was a mixed bag when it came to overall quality, 2 songs in particular stood out. Poncho and Lefty would become Townes' most successful and well-known song, followed by If I Need You in the number 2 spot. There's a lot of lore surrounding the writing of these 2 songs. If you talk to Townes, they basically came to him in a day, fully formed, and he was able to play them start to finish. In reading a bunch of interviews with his friends and family, he was working quietly on all of these songs for many, many years, and would only showcase them as these great revelations when they were fully done. But no matter how or when he wrote them, Townes had finally managed to write 2 songs that would be popular for his version rather than the covers that other more famous people would perform. By early 1973, Poncho and Lefty was continuing to find an ever-growing audience on the radio, but Poppy Records filed for bankruptcy and ceased all operations. The details of what actually transpired are not terribly clear, but what is well known is that Eggers sold all of the label's assets to United Artists for some amount of money and then went into hiding when he gave Townes none of it. So, he did what he always did when he didn't know what else to do. He went back to Austin. One night while performing at the Saxon pub, Townes got into a fight with his then girlfriend. But since he was an alcoholic heroin addict, an argument quickly escalated into Townes pinning the girl to the ground with a knife to her throat. Obviously, the 2 broke up that night, but in the same evening, a young lawyer named Peggy Underwood, who saw this whole thing happen, started chatting Townes up. Things escalated when Townes ripped her shirt open at the bar, and the 2 went home together later that night. As was his custom, the next morning, Townes just didn't leave. He moved in with Peggy, and if you can believe it, his addiction hit a staggering new high. He began injecting not just heroin, not just cocaine, but actual Jack and Cokes into his veins. I can't even begin to list all of the reasons you should not do this, least of which is the carbonation in the Coke, but there are several other reasons that this is very, very dangerous. Do not ever do this. And he did it regularly while fucked up on codeine. Not surprisingly, Townes was in a deep depression, convinced he was going to die soon since he had just turned 29, and that was when Hank Williams died. He talked about it constantly like he didn't have a choice, like it was some obligation of his occupation. If you want to be a folk singer, you gotta die at 29. Obviously, that's not true, and Townes kept playing music and writing new songs. With a fresh batch of songs, Townes was eager to record. A friend and local at the Houston clubs named Earl Willis had been trying to convince Townes that his next record shouldn't be in the studio, but rather a live performance. It was unusual at the time, but Willis convinced Townes that the only way to truly capture his performance was with a live recording. So, that July, Willis set up the most portable 4-track recorder 1973 had to offer, and they recorded 5 sets at the Old Quarter where Townes played every song he had ever written, and many of them several times. In total, they had 75 recordings of 40-some-odd songs. Now, for some reason, when they were done, they sent all the recordings off to Eggers for mastering, even though Kevin Eggers had closed down Poppy Records, sold all of Townes' music, not paid him for any of it, and basically went into hiding, thinking any normal person would be super pissed off and hunt him down. Luckily, it was Townes Van Zandt, so he probably didn't even notice. Eggers mastered the tapes, but not having a record label, he just shelved them. It would be years later before anybody actually got to hear this album. After the recording, while doing a radio show in Houston, Townes met a self-proclaimed horsewoman named Cindy Sue Morgan. The two bonded quickly over their love of horses, and later that summer, Cindy Sue dropped out of school and moved with Townes to Colorado. Once again, Cindy was only 15. Somehow, she convinced her mother to let her drop out of high school, leave Houston, and live the life of a cowboy with a stranger in the mountains of Colorado who she just met. Now, going forward, I don't want to paint the wrong picture. I found several interviews that claimed that folks that knew Townes say he didn't know shit about being a cowboy. He could put a saddle on a horse, and he could ride that horse, but that's about it. He didn't know anything about survival or living on the range, but that didn't keep him from claiming he did. He would use trips like this to dry out from the booze and heroin. He wasn't without liquor entirely, but he knew he only had so much, so he would drink it with moderation until they were able to get back to town. Then he'd come down out of the mountains and begin ramping his vices back up again. This trip with Cindy Sue was no different. After a few weeks of going cold turkey on H and limited whiskey, the two returned to Houston in familiar patterns. At this point, Townes was driving to the east side of Houston to score his drugs, shooting up, and then going to perform every night at the clubs. He probably would have become completely destitute if not for his friend Mickey White stepping in as a de facto manager and booking a few club and college gigs for him. In January 1974, Cindy Sue turned 16, and 2 months later, Townes turned 30. He had learned her age a few months prior when she accidentally let it slip to Mickey, who immediately told Townes. Townes did not have the expected reaction, and the two remained together. Meanwhile, the late great Townes Van Zandt was actually continuing to sell pretty consistently, and still getting good radio play. Townes made his way up to New York and reconnected with Eggers. Eggers was rushing to set up his new label, Tomato Records, so that he could record a new Townes album and strike while the iron was hot, or at least kind of warm. The two went down to Nashville to record with Jack Clement in his studio. As always, Townes had a mix of new songs and a few he had been holding on to for years, waiting till they felt ready. Clement assembled a quality group of session musicians and focused on producing an album of straightforward arrangements and not murdering Eggers, who he felt was constantly a nuisance in the studio. Unfortunately, when recording was complete, there was a problem. Clement had fronted Eggers all of the money for the studio time and had refused to hand over the tapes till he was given his $6,000. Eggers, of course, dodged him for several weeks before finally admitting he did not have the money and had zero intention to pay him. Hearing this, Clement put the entire record on a shelf. Townes, for his part, was just happy to be done with all the pressure of having to be places at certain times and went back to Texas on a mini tour that included a stopover at a venue in Austin called the Armadillo World Headquarters. What's interesting or worth noting about this place, it was the place where a new scene called Cosmic Cowboy was developing. This would later become the Austin Sound. It was a more progressive and slightly rock-fueled country. As winter was approaching, Townes got the idea that a winter tour of the Rockies would be a bunch of fun, and it would be even more fun if he brought all his friends. So we got Mickey White and Rex Bell, and they formed the Hammer Ridge Mountain Boys. The name was a joke at first, but then they got high and forgot to think of a real name, so they just went with that. As luck would have it, this is also around the time when Townes' buddy, Johnny Guess, showed up with a used RV he called the Blue Unit, and Townes immediately recruited Johnny for the tour. They managed to book gigs through Illinois, Wyoming, and Colorado, and set out in the Blue Unit for adventure. Now, it would be impossible for me to list all of the stories I found about the Rocky Mountain Tour of 1975, but if you're curious, there is a book that's dedicated to this called The Gulf Coast Boys that details all of the things that happened, and I was able to read a good portion of it, and it's pretty good. Some of the highlights, since we don't have time to hit everything, include shows on various combinations of cocaine, whiskey, and LSD, while half the band was secretly doing heroin on the days they could afford it, and speed and vodka-fueled drives up winding mountains to get to the next show. Not to mention all the gambling and women and just general chaos that an environment like that generates. It's a cool story, but we just don't have the time. For a little while, Cindy remained naive about Townes' heroin use, but when you're driving around in an RV, you can only hide so much, and it wasn't long before she began to ask Townes to try it. To his credit, he refused, and he made it very, very clear that no one was to give the 16-year-old girl he was dating any heroin. Not even a teensy bit. But of course, they didn't listen, and Rex's girlfriend did let her try it. Eventually, the tour did wrap up, and the crew headed back to Texas. By 1975, the Houston scene was long dead, and Nashville was even starting to wind down. But Austin was just getting started. That September, Townes recorded a set for the Austin City Limits TV show and moved into a friend's trailer in the Clarksville neighborhood on the west side of Austin. Small digression for a moment. If you don't know what Austin City Limits is, and I've met a ton of people that don't, and you like music, you need to Google this. It's the longest running music series on TV in America, and they tape it right here in Austin. The tickets are only available to people who either donate money, and I mean a lot of money, and people like me that get lucky in the raffle that they enter every single week to go to one of these live tapings. Even still, I've lived here 16 years, and I've only ever seen Jack White, which I technically paid my way into, and the Black Angels. So they're pretty hard to see, but you can all watch them on your local PBS station. There's several every year. There's a huge back catalog online. If you like music, these are awesome performances, and I'm always surprised at how many people have never heard of this 40-plus-year-old series. Also of note, I actually used to live in the Clarksville neighborhood of Austin, and that neighborhood has a really weird past. Apparently, it was established after the Civil War, and as a way to try to force black people out of the neighborhood and onto the east side of the city, the folks that were in charge said, you know what, let's not run any power, let's not run any water, we won't even pave the roads, and it'll become so undesirable that everyone will leave, and then all the white people can move in. But that's not what happened. Because it was so underdeveloped, and many of the homes were using kerosene lamps and outhouses, the neighborhood became a weird bohemian enclave filled with undesirables and outsiders. And according to Cindy, everybody was on heroin. Townes loved it. He wanted to live the life of a poor cowboy, and his double wide with no furniture sounded pretty cowboy to him. Even better than that, though. Just around the corner was a liquor store and a pharmacy where they sold syringes and codeine-filled cough syrup with not a lot of questions. What's even crazier is it wasn't just Townes and Cindy. There was a constant parade of people staying for either a little or a long time. They were musicians and vagrants and even ex-girlfriends of Townes, which is even more amazing and shows how charismatic Townes Van Zandt must have been. Because if you read the stories, most of these women were either straight up left by Townes in an apartment where he went on tour and never came home, or became so incredibly awful that they left him. But eventually they missed him, and they came back to live with him and his new girlfriend. Now, in all fairness, a lot of these women had also picked up some habits from Townes, specifically heroin, and they knew that by living with Townes, they had found somebody who they could chase a high with. But a number of them reported just really enjoying spending time with him. He was considerate and a good listener and sensitive, assuming he wasn't on codeine or, drunk out of his mind. In any event, they were all happy in their own Wild West, raising hell, doing drugs, and occasionally even remembering to write some new music. When the mayhem did stretch beyond the confines of his Austin playground, that's when Townes would begin to get himself into trouble.
I came of age and I found a girl in a Tuscaloosa bar.
Okay, gang, that's where we're going to leave off this week. That's part 1 of Paper Cowboy, the life and death of Townes Van Zandt. I hope you're enjoying it. It is a long and interesting story. Can you believe that you can be a lifelong heroin addict and not die? It's fascinating, isn't it? We'll conclude things next week, and then it'll be back to business as usual. I think next up on the docket is Weezer's Pinkerton, so we're going to have a lot to say about that. Until then, though, please, if you can, the number one thing you can do for us, go out to the Apple Podcast app, throw the 5 stars up there, write us a review. It's all we ask. We don't have commercials. We don't ask for money. That's all we want. 5 stars. Get in there, throw the 5 stars up there, do us a big favor. Otherwise, you can reach out to us, find us on all the podcasting platforms you know and love. We want to hear from you. You can email us at hatePodMail@gmail.com. You can also click on contact us at hatepod.com. You can also reach out to us on Twitter at albumhatepod, or you can find Garrett on Twitter at gharveytweets. I want to hear from you. I've been having some fun conversations with you guys lately. Keep reaching out. You can also find us on Instagram at hatePod. We have Discord servers. We have subreddits. We've got it all, folks. We've got a Facebook page, but neither of us remember the password, and frankly, we just don't care about Facebook. So if you want to get a hold of us, use any of the many other ways to do it. If you want to join the Discord server, we do not remember how, so you gotta reach out. If you put it up on Twitter, I'll retweet it, and somebody who knows how it works will tell you. We'll be back next week with part 2, an exciting conclusion. Spoiler alert, he may do more drugs. Until then, I have been your one and only host, Garrett Harvey.
There's cowboys running through my dreams. Nothing's quite the way it seems. I joined the Navy, got kicked out in a week. My facial features aren't distinct. Try to find some meaning in these songs. The genius is a genius, got it wrong. No, it's a lobster murder sex thing. It's the bleaching of the rear. A full assault on both your ears. The riffs are too repetitive. The lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides. The cover art's a mess. Listen to it for a week. Now that week has passed. It's the Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.